Hello. At the end of the 80s, the UK's fourth terrestrial television channel wanted to create a new game show that would challenge teams of competitors to elaborate physical and mental puzzles, the likes of which had never been seen before. But from whence would come the source of such daring adventure? I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're seeking the origins of the Crystal Maze. The Crystal Maze was a UK institution when I was growing up. I used to have to make sure I was in my pyjamas before it started because I had to go to bed immediately after it had finished. It was something that was absolutely the highlight of my week, and when its theme tune started, I was just in heaven. The theme tune remains an absolutely incredible classic. It goes something like bum 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 bum. Okay, well, it's much better in real life, but truly, if you've never heard it, you should definitely check it out because it is fantastic. And what a show it was that came after that intro. A series of puzzles and adventures, challenges and jokes, just a magnificent experience, the cornerstone of TV for that era. This is a video about the history of the start of the Crystal Maze. And yes, it's quite a departure for the channel, but don't worry, there are reasons. And if you do enjoy this unusual video from me, then please feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The Crystal Maze was often a matter of time. 6 contestants raced around time-themed zones, taking on time challenges in pursuit of time crystals. Each crystal gave you 5 more seconds in the grand finale, the Crystal Dome. And whilst you were in there, you would try and grab as many gold tokens as you could in the hopes that you would win a prize. Of course, if you grabbed a load of silvers, well, you maybe wouldn't come out so well. The contestants were ushered around the maze by the Maze Master, a character of enigmatic and chaotically playful energy, played for the first few years by actor Richard O'Brien. The challenges ranged from complex mind games to dexterous puzzles to feats of physical agility. But if you failed to complete your challenge in the allotted time, you could get locked into the puzzle room for the rest of the show, unless your team were willing to sacrifice a crystal to get you out. This show was like the ultimate escape room, except it wasn't just one, it was like 12 back to back to back. And if you were humiliated and failed to complete it, well, that would be captured on national television. Like anything that is quintessentially British, the story of the show starts exactly where you would expect it. Another country. In this case, France. In the early 80s, a French game show called La Chasse au Trésor, or The Treasure Hunt, followed a team of contestants who had to solve riddles in the studio whilst a helicopter-riding treasure hunter would fly around the country at their direction, trying to find the treasure. The creator of the show was a French TV legend, Jacques Antoine. During a particularly tough challenge on the show where a co-presenter almost drowned swimming to a ruined sea fortress, Antoine was struck by an idea. What if you could make an entire show about contestants almost drowning at a sea fortress? The name of that sea fortress was Fort Boyard, and Antoine had just invented Les Clés de Fort Boyard, or the Keys of Fort Boyard. In the show, teams of contestants would complete challenges on and around the fort, or risk being eaten by the tigers that were caged in its centre. Fort Boyard itself was the remnants of a Napoleonic sea fortress on the west coast of France. Plans for the fort had initially been drawn up in the late 1600s, but when the enormous construction costs became clear, Louis XIV's leading military engineer Vauban is said to have told the king, "Your Majesty, it would be easier to seize the moon with your teeth than to attempt such an undertaking in such a place." And that's where the matter would rest, at least until Emperor Napoleon, who some would say had expensive tastes, would greenlight the project. Construction started in 1801, but by the time it was completed in 1857, cannon ranges had actually grown to such a distance that the fortress was no longer necessary to protect the coast. For many years after, the fortress would act only as a military prison, and then following that, it would face decades of abandonment until it finally fulfilled its destiny as a games show. It has been said that Antoine was keen to evoke the sense of mystery and adventure that comes from Dungeons & Dragons, which was why he introduced so many fantastical elements to his final version of Fort Boyard. Even without anything having been filmed, the idea and Antoine himself were just so compelling and exciting that UK production company Chatsworth Television had already secured the UK rights. Channel 4 were interested in the show, but that proof of concept would be required, and unfortunately for Chatsworth and Antoine, Fort Boyard was undergoing renovations in order to make it possible to film on it in the future. So they set about creating a new pilot episode on a purpose-built set at Elstree Studios. At a cost of around £125,000, a mock-up of the fort was built in the studio, including the tiger cages, and the pilot would serve to demonstrate how the show could work. In France, snippets of footage from this pilot were even used in adverts aimed at recruiting contestants for their up-and-coming version of the show. If you look closely, you can just glimpse the UK host, veteran musical, theatre and film actor Richard O'Brien. O'Brien was famous for writing and performing in the wildly successful gothic schlock comic musical The Rocky Horror Picture Show, and for co-writing and appearing as Riff Raff in the movie adaptation in 1975. He is also memorably featured in Flash Gordon as the pipe-playing tree man Fico. But one thing he'd never been was a TV host, and he wouldn't be asked to do that for the Crystal Maze either. Speaking with Jacques' Throwback Attack podcast, producer David G. Croft remembers,
"What the host of the Crystal Maze was doing was they were being a character, not a presenter." Does that make sense? And that's why, also, we didn't want people watching it going, "Oh, that's that bloke from what's-her-name." We wanted the show to be as strange and unusual and different to the audience as we possibly could. So the last thing we wanted was a presenter where people would go, "Oh yeah, he does that other game show."
Reflecting on why he was chosen, Richard O'Brien has often likened the role of the Maze Master to that of the Dungeon Master in D&D. Although the producers have always denied it, he remains convinced that that is part of his journey to becoming the host of the show. His performance as the Maze Master on the Crystal Maze was one of enigmatic and flamboyant brilliance that defined the show in the minds of millions. With O'Brien on board and a successful pilot recorded, Channel 4 were sufficiently impressed to order a complete series commission. Things were ready to go for a British version of Fort Boyard. But fate and the fort had other ideas. The renovations at Fort Boyard had been beset by bad weather and were taking longer than initially expected, so it would be unavailable during the period that the show would need to film. Jacques, Antoine and the Chatsworth Television team, led by producer Malcolm Hayworth, got together over a long weekend to make alternative plans. An entirely new vision for the show would be crafted from scratch. This would be the Crystal Maze. The fort was done away with entirely, as were the toothless tigers. No contestant was ever going to get eaten by them anyway. There would be completely new puzzles and games, and a whole new theme that amped up the mystery and oddness of the entire proposition. Despite being an adaptation of Fort Boyard, it would actually make it onto screens 5 months before its French counterpart. But there was a clause in the contract. Antoine had made sure that to prevent any competition with Fort Boyard, the Crystal Maze could never be shown in Europe. The Crystal Maze would be filmed on a new, dedicated set that traversed time and space, and at its heart would stand the Crystal Dome, a huge chamber built on top of enormous fans. Production designer James Dillon, the man behind the look of shows ranging from Taskmaster to The Mighty Boosh, would design and construct the maze at Shepperton Studios, at a cost of around £250,000. According to Crystal Maze game designer David Bodicombe, in a comment at the Bothers Bar website, the producers asked the designer to make an internal mock-up of a castle for use as a pilot. And the designer, James Dillon, said, "Sure, I can give you a castle, but I could also give you other areas as well." And so the idea of the zones was born. The 4 theme zones represented different times and locations. The industrial zone was quite literally an industrial plant or factory of some kind. The Aztec zone was based on an ancient Aztec temple. There was a future zone which had a run-down, almost Red Dwarf style feel, and the medieval zone was that original interior of a castle that was requested by the producers. After the first series, the show would be forced to move its filming location from Shepperton Studios to an empty aircraft hangar because the stages that had been earmarked for the Crystal Maze ended up getting consumed by the production of an altogether different medieval zone, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. The crystals for the show were in fact Swarovski crystal, though whether or not they grant the users special powers or healing abilities, I've yet to ascertain. Fort Boyard largely used physical games to challenge its players, but the Crystal Maze would have a more diverse array of puzzles, games, and challenges. They were split into 4 categories: mental, mystery, physical, and skill. There would actually be 48 separate games produced for each season of the show, so that no game would ever be featured more than once or twice. In an interview with Jacques' Throwback Attack podcast, Richard O'Brien said of the comparison between the original Fort Boyard and the reimagined Crystal Maze that we went into the same kitchen with the same ingredients and made a souffle, and they had a stodgy cake. Where I'm from, them's poetic fighting words. In that same interview, O'Brien recalls that the games and puzzles for the first 2 seasons of the show were sourced from 4 different groups, though he only goes on to name 3 of them, which leads me to believe that maybe Mumsy played a role. A number of games were developed in-house at Chatsworth Television, and fans were encouraged to submit their own ideas that might get used in the future. According to one such fan whose games did make it onto the show, Phil Newton England, the requirements for games were that they were colourful, looked good on screen, and that they may be easy for some people to solve and harder for others. The second source of games was the High IQ Society, Mensa. And then the third source that O'Brien mentioned was Games Workshop. See? I told you there was a reason. The Games Workshop team included Albie Fior, the writer and editor in charge of White Dwarf's D&D column The Fiend Factory, Andy Jones, the designer of Warhammer Quest and later GW's head of global new business development, and Jervis Johnson, the game designer behind Blood Bowl and about 40,000 other classic titles. How exactly GW came to be involved remains something of a mystery, though White Dwarf 123 from March 1990 does share the news in understated fashion. Not to mention that Games Workshop would be featured in Brookside. Games Workshop would design puzzles for the first and second seasons of the show, but before the third series would start, Richard O'Brien recalled that there was a strange request. GW insisted that all of their puzzles be used, not just a cherry-picked list of the best ones. According to other sources, there was a slightly different request that only Games Workshop puzzles be used and no other source be allowed to have games on the show. As the producers had gotten more familiar with what made a good TV puzzle, they felt that they no longer needed the support from GW, so they declined the request, and Games Workshop walked away. In more recent years, Andy Jones mentioned in an interview with TechRaptor what happened when he attended one of the Crystal Maze game centres. Whilst in the studio, I got to design a bunch of games for the Crystal Maze TV show, which was a blast. As a result, when the Crystal Dome game centres opened up and down the country, I got the highest score ever and a nice award certificate, until my idiot pal Bob Avery proudly says, "My pal Andy designed all of these games, you know." After which we were unceremoniously booted out. And who knows, perhaps the Zinchian Crystal Labyrinth maybe owes a debt to the Crystal Maze. In 1991, the show would actually receive a board game of its own, though not one produced by Games Workshop. Instead, it came from their partner in HeroQuest, Milton Bradley. The MB Crystal Maze game was described as a time travel adventure game, and it would see 2 to 4 players moving around a board that recreated the 4 zones of the maze. The aim was, of course, to collect crystals, and this could be done by completing physical games of dexterity and smarts against the clock. There were 2 games for each zone, with some using tokens and others having 3D components. Everything from robo-arms and proton rods to space shuttle marble runs and a miniature rock lobber. Once you had a crystal from each zone, you could take on the final challenge, the Crystal Dome. And this was the innovation of the game, the dome itself. This plastic dome serves 3 purposes in the game. First, it is your dice. You roll the dome, and when the ball in the middle lands on a surface, that surface will tell you the number of spaces that you can move on the board. Second, there is a sand timer that can be sat into the middle of the dome, counting down the time you have available to solve your puzzle. And finally, it is the finale. The player fills the dome with some silver and gold tokens and has to shake them out through a small hole in the top. Get enough gold tokens, and you win. The cover art for the game was by artist David Skew, who is perhaps more familiar to some for his awesome cover work on the reprinted Space Crusade box. Interestingly, the puzzles and playing pieces from the game were reused for a French board game, Le Monde Fantastique, based on a 1994 French television program. This was another show from Jacques Antoine, and it was based on his work developing the Crystal Maze for Channel 4. Except in this version, it was aimed at children, and it featured a crashed extraterrestrial robot trying to repair its ship for takeoff. Back in the UK for the 4th series of the show, the maze itself would change. The industrial zone was removed completely in favour of a brand new ocean-themed zone. A luxury cruise liner that had sunk to the bottom of the water and was preserved in a bubble of air. It seems that there was concern about the industrial zone being too drab and uninspired. But to be honest, I always liked it, and the ocean zone never quite took for me. It was probably just coincidence, but after the betrayal of the industrial zone, Richard O'Brien decided that the 4th series of the show would be his last. He was afraid that he would be typecast as a TV personality, and the door would close on the film and theatre projects that he loved so much.
I wanted to quit while I was still ahead, and I didn't want to wake up one day and they say it's no longer pulling in the audience that we imagined, and we're going to move it to the afternoon, 4:00 in the afternoon. And I didn't want that to happen. There's no reason why it should, but there's no reason why it shouldn't have done either.
Of course, we would see O'Brien mastering a maze once again in the year 2000 adaptation of Dungeons and Dragons, perhaps closing the loop on why he felt he was hired in the first place. Officially, the Crystal Maze didn't end in 1993 though. There would be another maze master in the original run, former 10-pole Tudor frontman Ed Tudor-Pole, who hosted the show for a further 2 seasons. But even the Swords of 1,000 Men couldn't save the show, and it was cancelled in 1995. Later revivals and interactive experiences would bring the Crystal Maze into the modern era. But for me, the show did end when Richard O'Brien and Mumsy left the maze and rode off into the sunset. The original show, its games, its zones, its character, still feels unique in the history of British television culture, even despite the remakes and the rivals. In 1998, when Channel 5 did actually bring the original Fort Boyard to British screens, it just felt like a pale imitation. For me, the Crystal Maze was a huge part of childhood, and it was fantastic fun that really captured a certain era of British television. It's strangely heartwarming to me, I'm not sure why, but to find out that Games Workshop, even though I'd never even heard of them at the time, were a part of something that was so important to me. I don't know. There were lots of other creatives involved. It's not like Games Workshop made the show, but just to know that they were a fraction of helping to create something that mattered a lot to me as a kid, it feels like one of those unusual, fated, closed loops again. It's nice. Thank you for help in my research and for footage of the Crystal Maze board game goes to Phil Newton England, who actually designed games for the original run of the show. His YouTube channel is full of loads of really interesting stuff about the Crystal Maze. I've linked it in the description below, so go and check it out if you want to find out anything more. It's well worth it. I hope that you've enjoyed this sojourn into television history this time. I certainly had fun reliving my Crystal Maze memories. If you did, feel free to leave a like, to leave a comment, and to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the work that I do here even more, and you've got the means and the inclination, why not check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. You'll get a chance to vote on future priority topics for new videos, as well as some exclusive stuff like behind the scenes blogs and my interview with Thomas Pyranin. If you want to, you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter, where I share all sorts of random nonsense. I am trying to build up my follower base there, just because I think it would be fun to have a bit more of a community in those spaces too. There's no obligation, but I really welcome anybody who wants to jump over and check them out. I've put links in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. My absolute favourite part of the show every week was when Richard O'Brien would say, "Start the fans, please." It was better on the show.